Welcome to the season 13 premiere episode of Third Song In with Chris Derrickson and Tom Polachek. We're back with our top fives. Today we're talking top five bands, choosing from one from each decade over the last 5 decades. How exciting is that? Stuff's making me feel old. That and the fact that I am old making me
Yes.
feel
I think the thing that's really making you feel old is how old you are.
old.
It's a theory of mine I've been working on.
I theorize. All right, so we're talking bands today, going through the decades of it's making us, if we weren't feeling old enough, we're going back to the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, all the way up to the present day. And Tom and I chose a band that was representative of that decade for us. And we left that fairly open-ended. That should be a fun discussion. I know that I was changing my picks all the way up until the moment I hit record this morning.
Yeah, that's the thing is we wanted to do another top five episode, and we may continue to do that next season as well. But the very first thing I think we thought of was, well, let's do top five bands. And then I sat down and started thinking about it, and I was like, this is going to be really fucking hard. Like, we might have to set some rules or something. And then I think it was your idea to pick one band per decade, which seemed like it would make it easier. I don't think it made it any easier at all because I talk about backups and runners up and second and third place. I was like you, I kept changing my mind and I couldn't figure out exactly even how to define it. So let's talk about that for just a second because a couple days ago we did, I think, come up with at least one ground rule, which
Yeah.
was that they had to be bands. So no solo artists. I think we were good with duos, although I don't know that either of us ended up picking any duo. And I don't really like Simon and Garfunkel. First of all, I don't think they make it all the way up to the 80s. Speaking of being old, but I like that's a duo. I don't consider them a band, even though I guess Art played guitar. I suppose they both play guitar. But I really try to think in terms of bands, and really they were like three, four, five, six-piece bands, even more depending on who we're dealing with. One of them, I think, has like 50 people at this point. But so that was one rule: had to be a band, couldn't be solo, probably not a duo. Then we didn't really talk about any other rules. So how did you approach this if you're trying to pick your top band per decade?
So, well, one quick clarification. We also were a little fuzzy on like Steve Earle versus Steve Earle and the Dukes.
Right.
I feel like he's Steve Earle all the way through. Maybe there's a slightly heavier sound, but I thought some of his more acoustic stuff was at just a different period in his career versus with the Dukes or not. So I would not put him in. There may be other bands with someone, somebody and the that would qualify, but we'll get to that in a bit. So I think what I did and what I struggled with was because I'm a tad bit obsessive when it comes to bands and
What?
music. Yeah, it's hard to believe, I know, but I tried to think of bands that I just could not listen to enough of their music at that time, especially. And I did also try to look and make sure that they had released music during that time period. Because there's certain bands that I may not have really started listening to until later in their career. And then I worked my way, you know, back through their
Yeah.
catalog. But I think I was pretty true to, bands that I quote unquote discovered or got into pretty early. And then I made sure they had at least a couple albums generally. And then we'll talk. I think you'll say the same thing I'm going to, which decade we struggled with most. But did you have any other ground rules or
I,
uh
no, I'm not sure if we approached it the same way or not. The way you described it sounds to me in my head like what I was doing, but I really picked. I ended up picking bands that dominated my listening for that decade.
yeah. Yeah.
For me, that made, with one possible exception, that pretty much also meant bands that put out, in my opinion, their best work in the decade as well. They didn't necessarily debut in a specific decade,
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not sure any of them debuted in the decade that I picked them for, but they did have solid and, in my case, usually kind of surpassing albums that came out in the decade that I picked them for. So I think it's kind of the same approach. I'm similar to you in that when I would discover someone, I usually would then go back. I would usually discover them because of something that was released then, and then go back and on a couple, or at least for a couple of these picks, probably my favorite albums of theirs may not even be from the decade I picked them for. But for most of them, and that is the case. That I not only did they do their best work, but it's also when I was listening to them the most. So,
Guess one last thing that I sort of tried to include was this idea of my music evolution. Because when we get to the 80s, there'll be an obvious choice that I could have made, but I didn't, and I'll explain why. But so I know that I feel that my music taste is broad. I'm guessing when people listen to my playlist, they're like, "Oh, it's a Chris song. That's what he listens to." But I feel
does it
like
sound
there
like
were
this?
some, yeah, there were some bands throughout the years that have changed what I like and who I listen to. So I tried to touch on that
Uh,
in most of the decades too.
all right, so let's start with the decade of our youth. I mean, there were earlier decades we were still alive, but the 80s, we had our driver's license. We get into high school, etc. So we started with the 80s, and we wanted to do 5 decades. So that's also easy, go back and pick our decades that way. But 80s for me was, I want to say, second hardest to pick a band for a completely different reason that my first hardest decade was. And that's because there were so many bands in the 80s.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the primary way people put out music was as a band as opposed to as a solo. And that made it hard to narrow it down, at least when I first started looking and searching on the internet. But then when push came to shove, my number one choice, although it may be a little problematic for you based on something you've said already, it was pretty easy choice for me. But what was your choice for top band of the 80s?
Well, as anyone who's listened to even a couple episodes would probably guess that my number one choice was Night Ranger because they had easily their best music back then. And I can go through the albums, but they started it right at the beginning of the decade, and I think they had three or four pretty solid albums. Their first couple were easily the best, but that was too obvious for me. So I went with another band I've talked a lot about, the Smithereens. So the Smithereens started me as much as any band. They started moving me away from the hair metal days and the metal and the hard rock. And a buddy of mine recommended that I listen to him, and I was like, I don't think I'm gonna like him, but I will. And I think he may have even given me the cassette. I think it was cassettes back then. And I listened to Especially for You, which came out in 1986. And I mean, I remember like there's certain albums you listen to and you just are almost immediately hooked. And the Smithereens were that for me. And I think they had some great albums later in their career, but I still think that the 80s is when they hit their peak. I think that Green Thoughts came out in 88, and
Mhm.
then 11, or Smithereens 11, which is also a great Spinal Tap reference, came out in 89. So I think three of their strongest albums right there at the end of the decade. And I bought both of those follow-up albums as soon as they came out. They got me into the power pop, saw them live. They're fantastic live, and I couldn't get enough of them. Even when I think their music started to trail off a little bit more into the 90s and later, I was still buying their stuff and listening to them. But this was, I think, the peak, and this is what started me down the path of non-hair metal, which everyone is thankful for.
Well, two observations. First of all, I would have guessed you would have picked Night Ranger,
Yeah,
but I agree with you on your choice of Smithereens, particularly because of kind of how pivotal it was for you.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
if we were roommates in 86, 87,
yeah.
and I never had even heard of Smithereens until you started playing them, and you must have, either bought that cassette or gotten that cassette while we were roommates, and you started playing it, and I liked it from the outset, but the more you played it, the more I liked it. And I believe that you and I went to go see them live at Mississippi Nights in St. Louis, and I think that
Yeah.
was the first concert I saw after I got to college, and one of the only ones I had because we never had any fucking money. So
Right.
I
Exactly.
think we scraped together the funds to go to the Smithereens show just because we both liked them so much. So I think that's a great choice. And 11 is my favorite of all
Yep.
times Smithereens album for sure. But especially for you is the one we played over and over because that was the first one you got. And
Yep.
you're right. I kind of forgot what their output was in the 80s, but I think that's a very good choice. If you use the criteria that I was kind of using for myself, I absolutely see that as being a great choice. So my choice, and again, there were a ton of bands. There were all kinds of bands that I thought about because there were just a ton of bands out there. And I ended up going with uh, the E Street Band, which I think maybe crosses your line when we talk about an individual artist. I agree with your analysis of Steve Earle, for example. I think the only Steve Earle album he put out with a band that wasn't really just an extension of him was probably that bluegrass one with Del McCoury, The Mountain.
Right. Yeah.
That's actually, I think, a band album
Yep.
because he trades vocals with people, and then all the musicianship is so important and different. But for me, Springsteen is an exception for the reason that when he does his solo albums, they are so different than his E Street Band albums. And I, the very first Springsteen I ever heard was The River. My parents had the album The River, which came out in 1980. I listened to that before I left for college. Hell, as I was entering high school, and I listened to it over and over and over again. And that is very much a band album. It is very much. It's not just him, although he's obviously the leader and the driving force. And then he follows that up, or they follow that up as a band with "Born in the USA." And then in 1986, they did a live. They put out a live album, which was either 4 or 5 discs. I can't remember. I think it was at least four, but it was live 1975 to 1985, and it really captured what it was like to go to a Springsteen concert with the E Street Band and just what a big, huge event it was and how important Clarence Clemens was to that band and everybody that played in that band. And that's definitely when I discovered Springsteen was with The River in 1980. And after that, I did go back and I found, for example, Asbury Park, which may be my favorite Springsteen and E Street Band album, truthfully. But his output in the 80s was just, it's when I started to listen to him, and it's when he exploded, obviously, onto the stage with the band. In the meantime, he was also doing other, I think Nebraska came out also in the 1980s, but I'm not even counting that or thinking about that in terms of picking my favorite band. So again, people sometimes think of Bruce as the only person on the stage, but when he's out there with the E Street Band, it's a different experience entirely. And just got to see him live about a month ago, and it's the same way. I mean, the band is such an integral part of what he does and the music that they put out. So my 80s band is Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. My runner-up, my close runner-up was REM, who obviously churned out a lot of great music in the 80s. That was a big college band when we were in
Yep.
college. But for me, I kind of didn't listen to them as much until late 80s into the 90s. That's when they hit me, and I really started to appreciate REM more. I just kind of was behind the curve, I think, with that. Whereas with Springsteen, I was all Bruce all the time, as you've mentioned in the past.
Yeah, that was I'm not surprised by the choice. Let's move on to the 90s before I make my other comment about a band that I'm a little surprised is missing. But so 90s was a very, very difficult decade for me to choose. There's two bands that I've gone back and forth. In fact, as I was typing this, I'm like, I'm gonna jump right into it. The band that I thought I was gonna go with was the Subdudes. I listened to everything they put out in that decade. I listened to everything they put out in following decades, and I think that's where I struggled, is they were the longer term for me. I went with Morphine. So I decided to go with Mark Sandman's I think very influential, unfortunately short-lived band because of his untimely passing. But the band Morphine was unlike any other band sound-wise that I'd ever listened to. They didn't have a guitar; they had a bass. I think it was like a two-string bass that he made himself. They had a fantastic sax player. I think it was Dana Colley, I think his name was, and drums, and his fantastic voice. And I think that's one of the reasons I decided to go with it is that Mark Sandman's voice and his singing were as much of an instrument as any other instrument played in the band. It was, in fact, all the way up to, I mean, they had four albums in the 90s, Good, which is their debut, Cure for Pain, which I think is their best, Yes, 1995, and then Like Swimming. And Like Swimming had almost like spoken poetry for several of the songs. It was pushing the boundaries a little bit more into stuff that I was not as familiar with, I guess, just not as comfortable with, but I ended up liking it because I appreciated where he was trying to take the band. And I think that might have been the last album they did. They put out some other albums after his death. They put out an unfinished album that he was working on. I'll have to double check that. But the 90s were easily the peak for Morphine. And they were another band that pushed me into territory that I wasn't sure I'd go to. And I really, really was influenced by that band. Subdudes were fantastic. I loved everything they did. But I ended up very slightly opting for Morphine.
Yeah, that I could see that being a very difficult choice for you, only because I mean, just even if you're a podcast listener, if you've listened to us in the past, you'd probably talk about those two bands equally.
Yeah.
I would have probably guessed Subdudes, only because
Yeah.
you know, and I don't know. Do you think these days, do you listen to more Morphine or Subdudes when you go back and listen to stuff?
Probably listen to more Morphine, interestingly
Do you?
enough. Yeah, because there's certain songs, the opening track, Any Cure, I think, I will never get out of my head. I remember I bought the Subdudes album at Street Side, probably CD, I can't remember. Started it up and just the opening, dun 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 dun, boom. Like just the
Mhm.
opening of that song is one of my, that was a totally different sound for me at the time too. That New Orleansy sound and everything else. And I could have gone either way. Don't
Yeah.
press me, or I might change my choice.
We'll have to stop the podcast now so we don't make any changes. Yeah, I like both those bands a ton. They were probably in my top five as I was sifting through 90s bands that were really important to me. I also like Sandman's other band, Treat Her Right,
Yeah,
which I think was more short-lived. I don't, it seemed like Treat Her Right only really did like an album or maybe two.
yeah,
Uh, but they also were weirdly, you know, their instrumentation was very weird. There was that, there was lots of harmonica, but like a weird
yep,
bass harmonica or something.
yep,
He was a talented dude for sure. And I love Subdudes. I mean,
yeah.
the reason I asked you the question is because I listen to much more Subdudes these days than I do Morphine. You know, I'll pull out a Subdudes song just randomly, probably once a month, and I don't do that as often with Morphine or Treat It Right, as far as that's concerned. But moving on to my pick, my second choice, by the way, was a band that really meant a lot to me, and I felt like I was, you know, you and I knew about them and a handful of other people, and that was about it. But that's the band Gear Daddies out of
Yeah.
Minneapolis. They were awesome and put out a bunch of great stuff in the 90s. They were also kind of a short-lived band. I think they might have only had two studio albums and then a crazy kind of rarities album that they had that had some live stuff in it, which I thought was hilarious. And because of that, because their output was a little more limited, I didn't go with them. The one I did go with was a hugely popular band in the 90s, and that's Counting Crows. And you know, I have this somewhat the same hesitation I know you do, which is I don't necessarily want to pick the popular band, but I still listen to Counting Crows regularly, and I think that Duritz is just such a talented songwriter, and he has such an unusual voice, and they were such an interesting band for that time. Uh, the albums that came out in the 90s were August and Everything After and Recovering the Satellite. So those are my two favorite Counting Crows albums. And they hold up so well. August and Everything After if it debuted this week, I think people would still rave about it as being very iconic, very different than what anybody else is doing. And then they also had a great live album that came out in 1998 called Across a Wire, which was just. I also noticed when I was picking my favorite bands, they invariably seem to have at least one live album out during that decade. And I just loved listening to their live music and listening to them talk in between and just how they reacted to the crowd. And that was definitely a Counting Crows thing for me. So my 90s band is Counting Crows.
Nice one. So the band I was going to mention, did you struggle at all with the Bodines?
Just a little bit. They were definitely, it was Counting Crows, Gear Daddies, and Bodines was kind of a distant third for me. And I
Okay.
did listen to them and I loved them a lot and kind of discovered them when we were in undergrad. And I've seen them live since then, and I still like the band, but they just didn't dominate my listening the way I think that Counting Crows did. So, or Gear Daddies for that matter. And Gear Daddies was, like I said, so different because there's very little to choose from with Gear Daddies
Yeah.
because they just didn't have a lot of output. Whereas Bodines put out a lot of albums and a lot of them actually in the 90s. But they were, as I said, probably a distant third for me for the
Okay.
decade.
I thought maybe the 80s, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, and that's just
Um,
it is come to think of it, yeah, when I say distant third, I think maybe it was more 80s, or at least in considering it, they had more of an impact on me in the 80s than they did in the 90s. What do you have for the aughts, the 2000s?
we came this close to having the same band.
I thought we were going to have the same band. I really did.
You know what? If you hadn't put your stuff first, I probably would have gone with the same band.
And by the
Figure
way,
it's a
when you
chance
say
to
put it
talk about
first,
other bands.
when you say put it first, I put it up there like 20 minutes ago. So you were definitely still on the fence.
Well, I had decided this was my hardest because of the number of bands that I was so into. So for me, the three that I was choosing from were the National, which was a huge band for me, and this was easily, I think, the peak of their not their career, but their output, some of their best albums. Drive-By Truckers, and then my ultimate choice, I went with Wussy. They're easily top three all time. I mean, they're still putting out really great music. It's funny because they're not popular per se, but they're incredibly well received by critics, which is almost popularity, and I still haven't shied away from them. We've talked many times about doing an episode about the voice, the voice that attracts us. And this band, as much as any, defines that for me because Chuck Cleaver's voice is off. I mean, he's doesn't have a pretty voice. I think it's Lisa Walker is the co-lead singer and co-songwriter. She's got a beautiful voice. So when those two come together and sing, that sort of combination always gets me. The Everybody Fields, which was a band, had oh shit, I'm forgetting her name, Jill Andrews and Sam, I don't remember his name. He had a terrible voice, like just a really whiny, almost like a bluegrassy type of voice, but he wasn't singing bluegrass. And she had this beautiful voice that complemented it so nicely. And that's what I get with Wussy. And they have songs where they don't sing together, but when both of them sing together, it's fantastic. So I just decided it was a chance to highlight another great band from the aughts. They had three fantastic albums: Funeral Dress in 2005, Left for Dead in 2007, and then their self-titled Wussy in 2009. I still am drawn to the first album of those, Funeral Dress. It's the one that hooked me, and it's the one I go back to time and again. So I went with Wussy despite leaning towards your choice. So
Yeah, I was like 99% sure we were going to pick Drive-By Truckers for this decade. And it's funny when you talk about Wussy because I think that decade is the decade where you and I probably had the least contact with each other.
yeah, yep.
That was when I mean, let's face it, kids were being born, careers were being built, or whatever, or we were punching in. I don't know. But I mean, I think we were very busy. And although we talked to each other, I think that was the part of the history of our friendship where we were sending mixtapes back and forth, but that was about all. We weren't talking a lot about the music we were listening to, or at least not very often. And I would not have known that you were listening to Wussy in that decade, or at least I don't remember that being the case. On the other hand, when we would exchange our traveling mixtape, it seemed like every fourth or fifth song, one of us was throwing a Drive By Trucker song on
Yep.
there. And we clearly, when we talked, we did talk about Drive By Truckers. And I think we were also seeing them live, and they were so good, still are so good live, that, as I said, I was almost convinced that you were gonna that was the one we were gonna match on. I don't think we can stress enough how much we both like that band. The songwriting, the musicianship, the guy who they it's I think it was mutual, but the guy they kicked out of the band was Jason Isbell, who is an amazing singer songwriter and musician in his own right. And it's not that he wasn't good enough to be in the Truckers. Obviously, some of their greatest songs involved him as the songwriter. But the fact that they did that and just kept rolling is amazing. That they existed before him and after him, and they just continued to put out great stuff. But in the 2000s, one of the most important, probably country rock or Southern rock albums ever came out in 2001 called Southern Rock Opera. It's just an amazing exploration of being from the South. You've talked about it on a number of occasions. Probably my favorite Drive By Truckers album of all time is Decoration Day, which came out 2 years later, 2003. The Dirty South came out in 2004. A Blessing and a Curse, 2006. Brighter Than Creation's Dark, 2008. All of those were in that decade. And they were it was phenomenal. And they would tour, and they just play a song from practically any album they put out just in that decade. And the crowd would go crazy. Plus, they also, talking about live albums, they had Alabama Ass Whoopin', which came out in 2000. There also was Live at the 40 Watt, which came out in 2005, which is an amazing live album that I ran across, I think, at a record store. It is just, to me, phenomenal what they've done in general. And in particular, in that decade, there is no question in my mind, they dominated my listening during the 2000s. I listened. I didn't have a backup actually in 2000s. It was just, I knew it was Drive By Trucker.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're making me somewhat regret my choice, but
Perfect. That's what I want.
I did it to have another band to talk about, but I agree. That was one of the greatest bands ever, Drive By Truckers. Just in that decade, they put out, as you said, just unsurpassed. I mean, those are some of the best albums we've ever. I mean, we talk about perfect albums, so from start to finish, every song is good. I mean, they've had three great songwriters in the band for for that time period when Isbell was with them. Three great guitarists. I mean, we saw them live down in Austin. That was a fantastic. I think I probably talked about that, but watching Patterson Hood sing and play, he just looked so happy to be there. It was infectious. It was so cool. It was one of the more memorable moments from a concert where I was like, damn, that dude looks like he's just having a blast. And he wasn't overacting or anything. He was just, you could see the happiness of him being on the stage, which was cool.
Yeah, that's it. He's put out some solo work, which I like. And he's a very literary guy, and his lyrics are very deep. And I like his solo songs and albums. But when they're together as a band, both with Isbell, which was probably the peak of Drive By Truckers, but even without them, they're such a band. And when you see them perform live, they're even, I think the most recent show I saw was probably 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago here in Chicago. And it seemed the same way. They seemed to love to play together. They seemed to, there was so much energy coming from the stage. Probably one of the best live, if not the best live show I've ever seen.
All right. That's going to take us to the 2010s. And for very different reasons, I struggled with this one. I don't know if it's because this is really the start of when we're streaming a little bit more. I'd have to think about the timing. But I have a lot of bands that I listened to in the 2010s, but I struggled with the one that dominated my listening in the way we talked about. So I actually went with two bands. I'm sort of cheating, but there's a crossover that's enough. I went with Richmond Fontaine and their follow-up band, essentially the D-Lines. And I would argue that Richmond Fontaine's stronger catalog is earlier, probably in the aughts, and I think they go all the way back to the 90s. But he was very clearly him being Willie Vaughton, who's you said literary, describing
Yeah.
Patterson Hood. You can't come up with a more literary songwriter, I don't think, than Willie Vaughton. And he was transitioning to these story albums. They're almost all of his albums in the tens, and then into his work with the D-Lines as a new lead singer is they're almost like listening to little books. The songs all tell a part of the story. And I think I chose for all of his, even the song titles, I think I chose for one of the, not a playlist pick, but a staff pick. Left Hook, like Frasier, just like
Yeah.
sort of cool literary song titles. I mean, I could read some of the titles, but even the album titles, Mr. Luck and Ms. Doom, the album that I felt really started the transition from Richmond Fontaine to the D-Lines was Colfax, which was a 2014 album. And it's just, I don't know, I listened to him a ton. I think this might be where I started to listen to where lyrics were predominant. I've always listened to lyrics, but this is a band that drove me in that direction because you've never bought into Richmond Fontaine. So many of
Right.
their songs, I think you call them a little whiny. But if you listen to
Droney.
the
Droney
Droney,
is
that's
the
it,
yes.
Droney. But if you listen to and pay attention to the lyrics, the songs are moving, I mean, and powerful. And that's prior to the 2010s. So we'll probably list a lot of their catalog on a website for these bands. We definitely encourage you to check it out. But this, I don't know, I struggled not because I didn't have a lot of bands that I listened to, but because I didn't have one or two that defined the decade for me. My backup was Ha Ha Tonka,
Hmm.
who I like to just listen to for fun, but they don't seem to have the depth of what I was trying to convey here. So, and we said, I think we're both going to say that the 2020s was the hardest, but the 2010s was hard
Yeah.
for me too.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm not a big fan of Richmond Fontaine. I actually like D-Lines a little bit more
Yeah.
as they've kind of evolved a little bit, morphed a little bit. But I will credit you with one thing in terms of the literariness of a songwriter. You also recommend Willie Vaughton's novels, his
Yeah.
fiction, and I read one of his novels called The Horse, and it was outstanding. It's one of the best books I read last year. So I like him, and you're right, I like his words, but I didn't like the music behind his words so much with Richmond Fontaine. I tried, I because you would throw a lot of their songs on mixtapes, and I'd be like, I don't love that one, but I'm going to listen to the album. And they never hooked with me the same way they did with you. And it may have been because I wasn't listening closely enough to the lyrics, but I think it just has a lot more to do with kind of the music behind the lyrics themselves. For me, 2010s, kind of similar to the aughts with Drive-By Truckers, I picked a band that existed way before the 2010s. And Drive-By Truckers started, making music back, I think, in the early 90s. But for me, they were my 2000s band because I felt that's where they really knocked it out of the park. And I feel the same way about my 2010 band, which is Lucero. And again, listeners to the podcast will not be surprised. They will also probably not be surprised. I didn't have a backup for the 2010s either, unless it was maybe Drive-By Truckers, because those are the two bands I listened to the most starting in 2000 and going forward. Lucero has a bunch of great work before 2010, and I've been following them a lot, definitely since before 2010. But if you look at what came out in the tens, Women in Work was to me a pivotal album for them. They did a little bit different. It wasn't quite so country. They added horns and they added kind of a Memphis feel. And I love Women in Work, which came out in 2012. Then they came out with All a Man Should Do in 15, Among the Ghosts in 18. Their EP, Texas and Tennessee, came out in 2013. And I love that. So I think it's only 4 songs, but I listened to that over and over and over again throughout that decade after it came out. And then also they had a live album, Live from Atlanta, which I think captured their live show. I can't put them quite up to Drive-By Truckers in terms of seeing them live and their entertainment value, but it's pretty damn close. They are an excellent band to see live. And then at the end of that decade, 2019, they had a weird. It's one of those where they kind of just slapped a bunch of what are they, demos and live things and stuff they recorded in people's living rooms. It's called Before the Ghosts. So it obviously was rarities from the album Among the Ghosts. And that was a lot of fun too, just to hear them, the kind of the creative process that you can pick up through that. So Lucero remains one of my favorite bands of all time. And as I said, I didn't even have a backup for Tens because they definitely dominated my listening. And I know, and you can vouch for it, they dominated my conversation about music throughout that
Yeah.
decade.
Agreed. That one doesn't surprise me too much. That's a great choice. If we're like having a poll to go back to back with Drive-By Truckers and Lucero is the 1-2 punch. That's the knockout right there.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with either of those bands, in my opinion. Which takes us to the 20s.
Yeah.
And that was tough, man. We had a little conversation without talking about what bands we were picking, but the 20s for me it was hard to say here's the band that really dominates my listening. And we talked a little bit about some theories for that. Why do you think it was so hard for either of us to pick best band of this particular decade?
Well, to me, it's taking what I sort of mentioned with 2010s and multiplying it by 10 because that was no pun intended or whatever that was. 2010s times 10. It's just the way that I think that streaming has changed our listening habits. And when I go through the bands that I considered, they're all over the place. Like literally even the genres are all over the place. So I sort of pulled a U and I chose a band that easily their best music is from several decades before, but their latest music shows that they're still very relevant. So that's what I ultimately went with because so many other bands, I mean, it's unlikely, but in another 3 months when we're recording season 14 or 13, whatever we're gonna do, I might not be listening to some of these guys, but right now they're important to me. So I'll go through those. What about you? Why was the 2020 so hard?
I think it probably stems from what you're saying, but I think there's the thing for me about the 20s is I think there's a lot of really great music out there,
Yeah.
but it also seems to be primarily solo artists.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, or I would hope, we may get some emails that will correct me and say, hey, what about this band? What about that band? And they may be out there, but at least as far as what I've been listening to, so many singer-songwriters, and I think maybe it comes from the way musicians get heard these days, which is social media, TikTok videos, and Instagram stuff, and some of it may have to do with the fact that we started out with a pandemic, and so many people had to perform by themselves. If they wanted to make music or get other people to hear their music, they were stuck in their basement or something, and they would record
Yep.
a 3-minute song, throw it up on TikTok, and then all of a sudden they'd have 1 million views or listens. And I think that has a lot to do with how music has developed over this decade in the last 6 years. I think that social media has had a huge effect. I think that the pandemic had a huge effect. And you end up with performers that I really, really like, but that don't fall within that definition we had about a band that's there as a band. One of my favorite performers of the 20s is Josiah and the Bonnevilles, but there aren't any Bonnevilles. It's a guy. And I think there's a lot of music like that. And I think it's great, but we'll have to come up with our top 5 solo artists, I think, before we can start talking about a lot of stuff I liked in the 20s. So the band I ended up picking was a band that has been around forever and preceded the 20s by a lot. But I found that I started listening to them much, much more late 2010s and then into the 20s. I've been listening to the Black Keys a lot. And they are a throwback, rock band, blues rock band, if there ever was one. And some of it may just be a little nostalgia because I'm really enjoying listening to that kind of sound. But they put out a bunch of work so far in the 20s, and I mean it's only 2026. They put out an album that was primarily covers called Delta Cream in 2021. that had Junior Kimbrough on it and R.L. Burnside, which are old blues guys that I love. I listen to their old stuff also. An album called Dropout Boogie came out in 2022. They did an album in 2024 called Ohio Players. No Rain, No Flowers just last year in 25. And then Peaches, which is their 14th studio album, came out in 2026. And I really, really like that album. So their output has been huge this decade, even though they were making records back in the 90s, I'm pretty sure. But I didn't listen to them as much. I knew who they were, but they had a couple popular songs, and maybe I caught them on the radio. But they are a band, even though it is primarily just two guys, but they play like a band, like a real blues rock band, and the musicianship means a lot in that group. So that's my pick, and it was very hard because they don't dominate the 20s for me the way Lucero did the 10s or Drive-By Truckers did the aughts, but there's just not a lot of bands out there that struck me that way.
Yeah. So I don't want to dwell too much on all my backups, but I went from everything from Arts Fishing Club, who I'm really into right now, but they have one EP out, which is fair. I mean, I feel like they're going to be a bigger part of the 20s when everything's said and done.
Yeah, that's just it. We're also only halfway through, right? That's a problem.
There's a rock band, I'll reference them in a little bit, called Dragged Under. I also looked at Beartooth. That sort of combination of like alternative music and this doom or metalcore, like where the guys will sing like really catchy stuff and then go into that deep voice that you hate so much where they're screaming.
I was going to say, I expected you to pick Beartooth just to spite me.
Yes. And Quiet Hollers, but I think their music was more of the 2010s. I love what they do. They're all over the place. They only have a single, I think, released in the 2020s. I could be wrong, but I just didn't feel that any of them dominated enough. So what I did is I decided to go with Fishbone. They've come out with a new album. They've always been socially conscious, if not, protest type of music. And they are as relevant today as they've ever been. They just came through North Carolina for their 40th anniversary tour. It was sold out. I mean, it's a smaller venue, but it was sold out. I was actually seeing Arts Fishing Club at the same time. I felt a little bit bad. It was literally next door. But, Racist Piece of Shit is right now in my top 5 all the time.
Yeah.
And they recorded a song with George Clinton. I mean, I've listened to them so much over probably the entirety of these decades that we talked about. I think they go all the way back to the 80s.
Yeah, I think,
and they're still doing it. If not the 90s for certain. They're still doing it, and they're still doing it well. And I'm glad that they were able to reemerge because they were quiet there for a while. I just assumed they'd faded away, but they're back with a bang. So that's what I went with, and I'm not going to change it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You're right. And like, any great band, obviously they have longevity. And really, when you look at everybody we picked, they're most of them are bands with longevity. Morphine, not so much, but there's a good reason for that. And Smithereens, same reason actually. Now that I think about it, if your driving force dies, then you're probably not going to be able to continue with the output. But I mean, look at all the other bands. They've been doing it for decades. So that's what made all of this a little difficult. If we ever do another top 5 bands, we may need to try a different format just to see how it shakes out. I've said it before. I also love Fishbone. I think it's interesting that we can pick them for a best 20s band.
Yeah.
When, the first time we heard them the first time I heard them anyway was on the soundtrack to the movie Tapeheads, which was 89, 92, something like that when it came out. I don't remember. So that is our list. Technically it's our top 5 bands. We have again 5 ties, which seems to happen frequently when we pick top 5 of anything. We will post our list on our website. It should be under the as mentioned page drop-down menu on thirdsonginpodcast.com. Take a look at it. Email us at thirdsongin@gmail.com with your comments, your disagreements, your own decade list for the 80s through the 20s. I'd like to hear what other people have to say. My guess is we will get a lot of corrections on the 20s because we're probably
Yeah.
missing some bands. The older we get, probably the less we find, some of the new stuff. But let us know what you think and reach out to us either through the website or at thirdsongunit@gmail.com.
That takes us to the Loft of Wisdom.
You better open up your eyes, baby, because fools do get wise.
It's the Loft of Wisdom, Tom.
The Loft of Wisdom are quotes. We like quotes. We like funny quotes, interesting quotes, deep, deep philosophical quotes. We pick them up everywhere. Sometimes it's a song lyric. Sometimes it's a line from a book. Sometimes it's what some crazy bastard on the street said in an argument with his girlfriend. But I believe this time around, we both went with song lyrics.
We did. I jumped around a little bit with this one, but in the end, I decided to go with a song which I've recommended before. It was a short-lived band called Buffalo Nickel. They were also short-lived for the reason we talked about. Their lead singer was killed tragically, I think before the album that this song was on was released. She was killed in a car crash. But she was a really talented songwriter and singer. And I went with this song. I was listening to it again, trying to figure out who I was going to pick. And I love the parallelism. Sometimes when they do that in songs, it gets to be a little too much for me. But this song starts out with, it's about a girl they call Little Debbie, who's struggling, I think, with some addiction issues and might be borderline suicidal. So the song starts off with, "Hey, little Debbie, what's the big idea? Smoking all my Virginia Slims and listening to Steely Dan records and humming along." So then it goes in. Actually, the song is called Lucinda Williams, but they never say Lucinda Williams until the very, very end of the song. It's very much a story throughout. And then she wraps it up really nicely, which I don't know why I didn't notice before, with this quote that I'm going to put on the loft, saying after she's gone through some struggles in the hospital and everything else, she's like, "It seems that little Debbie's got some big ideas." So reflecting back, using big ideas in a different way. And now she don't smoke Virginia Slims and she listens to Lucinda Williams. So seems she's been empowered a little bit by music, that particularly of Lucinda Williams. It's just a really nice parallel in songwriting that I've been listening to forever and didn't really pick up on it until I was cramming for this episode. And I'm going with that one. It's a great song. It's a great quote at the end of the song. Great lyric at the end of the song.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I went with a band that probably was on my honorable mention list. Not probably, definitely was on my honorable mention list for the 2000s. The band is Marah out of Philadelphia. I love that band. They didn't quite make the top of the list for the decade of the 2000s. They really started putting stuff out. I think their very first studio album was in 1998. And the title of that album was "Let's Cut the Crap and Hook Up Later On Tonight." I think it's two brothers that are the leaders of that band. I think Belinsky, I think is how you say their name. I can't remember off the top of my head, but talk about amazing songwriters. Again, going back to Willie Vallotton and being literary, their songs are so poetic. And there's a lyric in from the song "Boat" from that very first album that is kind of a love song. Their love songs are never really like cut and dry love songs, but this one was, "Well, if you weren't so December, I would not have to be a coat. And if you weren't such a river, I would not be this kind of boat." And those four lines just sum up a relationship, or that relationship and a lot of relationships, I think, in such a odd way. It's just such a weird collection of words to describe how two people feel about each other. And I love it. And because I couldn't get Marah in on my top 5 list for any of the decades, I wanted to at least quote them in or on the Loft of Wisdom.
I like it. Really good. I haven't listened to that album as much as the other ones. But I agree. I flirted with using them for the same decade. I just never got to it. So,
all right. Next up is Post Facto.
It's a mistake. It's a mistake.
yeah, post factos where Tom and I either correct mistakes from previous episodes or complete sentences or just give you an update on something that we talked about in a previous episode. And I think that that's what Tom's got this week.
Yes, one of my staff picks a while back was a new album that, as we record, is still not out. Comes out, I believe, next week, second week of June, and that is the Ike Riley assassination. But this particular album is interesting because for the first time ever, Ike Riley did not write every song on the album. Half the songs are written by his son Shane. And Ike Riley and Shane Riley have been touring, I think, primarily just Northern Illinois, this Chicagoland area, which is where they're from, together as a kind of an acoustic duo. And I got a chance to see them perform at this cool venue in Ottawa, Illinois, which is not near, I don't know, anything. But the venue is called the Abbey, and it's part of the Ottawa Center for the Arts. It's in Ottawa, Illinois, which is west of Joliet by about an hour. It's almost an hour drive from where I live, which isn't exactly, the cosmopolitan center of the universe. But it's an old Episcopalian church that they've turned into a music venue. It has the most amazing acoustics, and they put on a fantastic show. It was just awesome. And I loved it so much, and I won't even explain all the details, but I then actually got to see them perform again the following week here in Joliet, playing at a Chicago Street Pub, which is owned by a friend of the show, Mike Trisna. And again, they put on a great show. Unfortunately, the Chicago Street Pub performance had some problems because we had some assholes in the back who thought that they were in their living room as opposed to, watching a concert. But they were still fantastic. Shane is turning into a hell of a songwriter. I mean, this is the first group of songs I've ever heard him write, but they're awesome. And I can only see a ton of potential for him. And his dad is one of those guys. Ike Riley writes songs like very few other people can. So I just wanted to post facto it and say, what a great show, particularly the performance in Ottawa. If you live in central or northern Illinois and hear about somebody playing at the Abbey in Ottawa, you should go see a show because it is worthwhile.
Let's move on to staff picks.
Just around the corner from you.
Staff Picks is an opportunity for Chris and I to make recommendations of new stuff coming out soon, new stuff recently out, or sometimes just stuff we've figured out has been out for a while. So what is your choice for your staff pick?
I went with one of the bands I mentioned a little bit earlier that might have qualified for the 2020s. It's the band Dragged Under. They're out of Seattle. Heavy sound. They do that combination of more melodic, but sometimes the metalcore, I think, is the subgenre. I love the guy's voice. The song is Rebel Sun Rise with an exclamation point. So you got to say it, excitement. If folks have listened to our show, I chose one of their songs for I'm going to forget the name of it, the one we did with Sloan Armstrong.
Yes.
I'm going to forget the name of the mix, but I remember the song is called Instability. And it starts out with this real heavy opening, and then somebody fucks up, and all of a sudden the lead singer's like, "Oh, what the fuck?" And then they just like jam right back into it. They sort of have those imperfections on a number of their songs, which I don't know why. I just really like that detail. It doesn't feel as slick or polished. And I think this band's going to become bigger in this genre. It's probably not something you're going to listen to all that much, but
I guess that because you referenced the one playlist I've listened to less than any other one we've created with a guest. That one is so hard, I just don't listen to it. However, we have listeners who do, so go out and listen to Rebel Sun Rise by Dragged Under.
What do you got?
So initially, when I wrote this on our outline, I was recommending a relatively new song. I can't quite figure out if the album it's on came out at the end of 25 or just came out here in early 26. It is the cover of a Butthole Surfers song called Pepper, one of my favorite songs by Butthole Surfers. I just love that tune so much. There's a woman who goes by S.G. Goodman. Never heard of her before myself. Love the cover of Pepper. I just thought it was outstanding. Since I put it on the outline, I've actually listened to the whole album, and the album is called Replanting by the Signs, and it's excellent. So I'm actually recommending the whole album. Started out as just that particular cover because I like the song so much, and it's such a different version. But she has cool ass voice, and she captures that kind of weirdness of the Butthole Surfers version of the song, but definitely makes it her own. So go out and find S.G. Goodman and listen to the whole album, Replanting by the Signs, and then listen to Pepper over and over again, like I had been doing.
Well, you're going to be proud because I've seen her name pop up on any number of best of lists over the last couple
Oh,
months.
nice.
Um, and I've not really, there's a lot of names you see on that, but I didn't know if it was a male or a female. I remember looking her up, obviously a female. I'm going to go listen to that one as soon as we hang up. So you might be the tipping balance. You might tip the balance for me to actually go listen to something.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah,
And this is,
I feel like she's one of those that's like she arose through social media or something,
yeah.
but who knows? I don't know where she came from. I'm just glad I figured out she's out there.
All right. So we are at the core of Third Song In, our playlist picks.
Yep. Every episode, we each pick a song for our season-long playlist. And I think actually we both picked really good ones.
Yeah, I went with a band that I didn't mention yet because I knew they were on the playlist pick, but the Vandaliers are really close for being my 2020s band.
Hmm.
I've been really impressed with everything they've done. They just came out with a new song called Girl on the Run. It's from 2026, as I said. I think it's nominally about some of the abortion rights issues. The lead singer for Vandaliers is transgender female and has recently revealed that. They're from Texas, so probably not the friendliest place in the world to reveal that information. And this song is about a woman who is dealing with the struggle to get an abortion legally. And it's also a protest song. It's some of the lyrics are, well, it's not what I want, but it's got to get done. I grab my purse and I load my gun. I won't bow to anyone. I'll be out by dawn. I'm a girl on the run. And you hear the I'm a girl on the run, multiple times throughout. It's a really powerful song, especially if you know a little bit more about the background of the band. They're putting out better and better stuff. The last album was awesome. I think it may have made my top 5 or top 10 when we did that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
they're
last year.
continuing with the strength of it with this one. I think your daughter is a fan of the Vandaliers.
She is. She likes the Vandaliers. I like the Vandaliers. They kind of slipped my mind when I was trying to come up with 20s bands. Probably wouldn't edge out Black Keys for me
Right.
for different reasons. But yeah, I agree with you. I think they have a lot of potential. My playlist pick is a song that I've known about for quite some time. It's called Sitting Right Here by the Sam Chase from the album Almost Done, which came out in 2020. Love this song. Oddly, you brought up Anna, my daughter. It was first recommended to me by her, actually by a friend of hers named Casey, who told Anna about it. Anna listened to it and thought, who's going to like this song? The old man. And she's right. It is a beautiful song. It's almost a spoken word delivery by the Sam Chase. That's again a band, although I think it may just be one dude, but possibly one of those 20s bands that I just didn't think about when we were putting together our other list. It is sung from the perspective of an old guy. In their case, they probably mean somebody like in their 40s or 50s, but it's a song about regrets and kind of standing still in your life. And I don't often quote lyrics, but I thought these are very, very cool lyrics. Am I just waiting for permission by doing what I'm told? I'm a stubborn old man with his life in his hands, which ain't that much left to hold. So it's not the most uplifting song in the world, but it's beautifully sung. It's a really cool tune, and I love the way that the lead delivers the lyrics on this one.
And this is a surprising episode. That is a band that I follow on YouTube Music because of you. I can't remember which
It happens
song
occasionally.
it does. There was a song you put on. It'll come to me at some point, but I really like them, and even if it's just a hymn, but I like It's one of the few recommendations that I've actually listened to for you.
Yes.
Third Song In is recorded in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Joliet, Illinois.
Please email us your questions, your comments, your opinions of our top 5 lists to thirdsongin@gmail.com.
Absolutely. And we ask you to check out our website, thirdsonginpodcast.com. All kinds of information on there. There's links to the actual episodes. There's links to our blog. When we do have guests, we put information about them on our As Mentioned page. We're updating it almost daily, and really appreciate if you check it out, thirdsonginpodcast.com.
Please follow us, rate and review us wherever you listen to the podcast. We're on all of those streamers, Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube Music, Amazon Music. Hell, we're on Pandora. We're on Overcast. Please give us all your stars. Give us all your stars. All your motherfucking stars.
Our playlists are out there on all the streaming services. Please check them out. Listen through them if you like them. I don't know if there's an ability to give us any of Tom's fucking stars, but we'll take them. We also ask you to share those playlists because Tom may not listen to the Sloan playlist that we did, but I listen to it about once a week because it is so heavy. But we got a wide range, some great playlists out there, including those that we do with our guests.
Please follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page. We've got Instagram and Blue Sky. We try to keep you posted on things that we are doing, but more importantly, we also try to forward on all kinds of details about our past and future guests, including appearances, releases, opportunities to see them or view their art one way or the other. So please follow us on social media.
You can get to our blogs on Substack. We have Third Song In set up there as a creator. We put out a blog every week, taking turns on which of us writes it. If you subscribe to Third Song In on Substack, you'll get the blogs in your inbox on Friday mornings. Easy way to actually get to some, we think, pretty good stuff we're putting out there in writing. So if you don't like listening, go read. You've been listening to Third Song In with Chris Derrickson and Tom Polachek. Thanks for listening. You can also follow us on Substack. That's an easy way to get to our blogs. Tom and I each write a blog. I think I'm going to write my next blog by talk to text and see how fucked up it is. Because obviously I can't talk. Guess I should pay attention. I was still trying to figure out that Sam Chase song. We're back with another top 5. Today we talk about our top 5 bands of all time, from decades, from stuff.